Well, welcome back, everybody, to CUGH's virtual summit, the Road to COP27. This is our third panel that we're going to hold in this consequential symposium. I'm Dr. Keith Martin, the Executive Director of CUGH, and I hope that you have enjoyed the first two panels, which were, I think, really superb. This particular panel was designed to build a bridge between what's happening now and what's going to happen a year from now in Egypt for COP27. I think all of us would agree, and what we've heard today is that we have two existential threats before us. One, of course, is the climate change threat. The other is the biodiversity crisis taking place now, the massive extinction crisis we're seeing. And both of these, of course, are interconnected, indivisible. And we sit in the middle of this. Our health, our well-being, our socioeconomic future is intimately entwined with these two crises before us. So this panel, we're going to discuss what we need to do, what we can do, and what we must do to be able to address this challenge, because clearly we cannot kick the can down the road anymore. What we do is going to be determined by us, and the future is going to be determined by us. So we have a stellar panel. I'm going to be extremely brief with regard to their introductions. You can look at them online and in the order in which they will appear. Ms. Laetitia Sieffert, she's a Program Management Officer at the Convention on Biological Diversity at the UN, as part of the UN Environment Program. She's in Montreal. Dr. Caradee Wright is a Senior Specialist Scientist at the South African Medical Research Council in Cape Town. Dr. Deoraj Caussy is an epidemiologist at the Integrated Epidemiology Solutions and at the Network of African Science Academies, and he is Mauritian. And finally, Dr. Diarmid Campbell-Lendrum, he's the head of climate change and health programs at the World Health Organization. So you can see we have a really integrated and superb panel, and they're going to share their views on what we can do in terms of moving forward and what ought to be on the agenda for COP27 in Egypt next year. So with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Sieffert. Laetitia, over to you, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Keith, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to share my presentation. Just a moment. Can you see my presentation full screen? Yeah, okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So to start with, I'd like to invite you to imagine ourselves next year in November in Egypt at COP27 and really thinking about what will have been achieved to date and what would be missing and what also might be different from today. And I'd like to share a few reflections in terms of the environmental governance, especially focusing on the Rio conventions. So by COP27, we'll have had, of course, the COP26, and hopefully we're going to see more publication and implementation of the nationally determined contributions. Also, hopefully, a finalization of the Paris rulebook, which is going to be really essential in implementing the Paris agreements. But on the biodiversity angle, we're going to also have had adopted the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which is really the framework for the next 10 years biodiversity targets. And so that will have also taken place in Kunming, China in April and May. And we'll also have had the conference of the parties of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification that will also have happened in May in Côte d'Ivoire. So of course, this is a very incomplete picture of how the world might look like at COP27. But I'm going to articulate my presentation around those linkages between biodiversity, climate change, and health. And Africa being a highly biodiverse continent, and Egypt also having hosted our COP14 in 2018, there's a strong opportunity also to really position this nexus at the highest level. So I'm going to start by focusing on the linkages between health and biodiversity, which might be less well known than the impact of climate change on health. So what is biodiversity? So biodiversity is really the complex interactions that happen between and within the species and that form the perfectly balanced ecosystems that support life. So if you look at the infographic on the right, biodiversity provides nature's contribution to people, It provides the water we drink, the food we eat, the cleaner we breathe, and the energy we consume. But it also is a key component for drug development and traditional medicine. So a lot of benefits, from biodiversity. And at the same time, of course, it's really essential to our physical and mental health, and at different scales, also up to the microbiome biodiversity, and also supports cultural and spiritual enrichment as well as animal welfare. But at the same time, biodiversity also enables to prevent and reduce the risks of climate change, disasters and pollution, and as well as the risk of infectious disease emergence. And as underlined in the IBES report on biodiversity and pandemics, by promoting conservation policies for biodiversity and avoiding the unsustainable use of highly biodiverse areas, we can also really reduce the interface between wildlife, livestock, and humans, and thereby also mitigate the risk of pathogen spillover. So the key message is really that our health and well-being depend on nature, and that the decline of biodiversity is undermining the web of life and the achievements of SDG 3. So in the next slide, I would like to also articulate a little bit more, looking more closely at this nexus between biodiversity, climate change, and health. So we know that climate change affects biodiversity and human health, but biodiversity can contribute to human health, as we've seen in the last slide, and also can support efforts to reduce the negative effects of climate change. So through nature-based mitigation, for example, through carbon sequestration, as well as adaptation measures, for example, also mitigating disasters risks. So the key message is, this nexus, it really provides opportunity for maximizing synergies between public health, climate change adaptation, and nature. And so biodiversity really, has this potential of supporting both human health and mitigating the impact of climate change, both on biodiversity itself and on human health.
Excuse me, sorry. I think we're only seeing the first slide. Do you have two screens? Potentially it's showing up in presentation mode on your other screen.
Okay, apologies for this. I think I'm unable to. Okay, is it better now?
No, now we're seeing the back end, but if you do, okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, so I'm maybe just going to go through this animation again. So climate change impacting biodiversity and health, but biodiversity helping to mitigate the impact of climate change and supporting human health, and really looking at this nexus. I think that's going to be much more explicit now with the animation. But I'm going to move on to the next slide, because another way of looking at those linkages is actually to focus on the common drivers. And so the IBES IPCC report has really emphasize those common drivers. And if you look at the infographic, some of the direct drivers for biodiversity decline and climate change are invasive alien species, the direct exploitation, pollution, land and sea use change. And so those affects, of course, the human quality of life, and including human health and well-being. Another important aspect is also the linkages between biodiversity loss, climate change, and pandemics. And the IBES report on biodiversity and pandemics has really shown that the underlying causes of pandemics are actually the same than the environmental changes that drive biodiversity loss and climate change. And again, including land use change, agricultural expansion and intensification, wildlife trade, and consumption. So now, if you look at the solutions for advancing climate change and health, I'd like to spend some time on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the framework I was referring to in the introduction, and which will really drive the biodiversity agenda over the next 10 years, and is going to be adopted at COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity next year in Kunming, China. So this post-2020 GBF, as we call it, has the vision of restoring our relationship with nature and achieving this living in harmony with nature by 2050. And this is supported by 4 long-term goals in the current framework that has been released, at least the first draft in July this year. We also have, as part of the post-2020 GBF, a 2030 mission to put biodiversity on the path to recovery by 2030. And so that is also translated with 21 action targets. And so there's one specific target that focuses on climate change, target 8, and health is also embedded in several targets, including targets 5, 7, 12, and 17. And in addition to the post-2020, there's also going to be a global action plan for biodiversity and health that will be adopted at COP15, and that really promotes the adoption of a One Health approach and provides recommendations for the parties to do so. As part of the broader agenda, the broader picture, of course, we realize that transformative changes are needed at the global scale, and the Convention on Biological Diversity produced a Global Biodiversity Outlook, the 5th edition, that really identifies 8 transitions that are needed to be able to restore a relationship with nature. Another very important solution is really to foster the uptake of a One Health approach, and especially a One Health approach that has a strong environmental pillar. So we've been working very closely with the WHO, with UNEP, and members of the tripartite to really be able to strengthen this pillar, and which also means, for example, having a health and climate components included in the national biodiversity action plans. We also need to really leverage ecosystems-based approaches and nature-based solutions, including through, for example, restorations, ecosystems restorations, and so on. And of course, we really need to activate the role of society approach and the role of government approach, having ministries of health, of environment, also working more closely together and really talking to each other. And then lastly, we also need to leverage the expertise and the traditional of IPLCs. And for example, in terms of health, also IPLCs have a lot to share also in terms of traditional medicines, and also approach also really also involves women also in those role of governance and role of society approaches. So coming back to the beginning, where we were thinking of what is missing in terms of the agenda for COP27, I think the first is really the importance of understanding those linkages. And so climate change is a public health crisis, but as well as biodiversity loss, desertification, and pollution. So really need to take this holistic approach and understand how the health of people and the planet is connected, and also care for nature the same way we care for health. And the second thing that we need, of course, is action, and we really hope that the post-2020 GBF is going to enable that and will provide clear guidance for the parties to be able to implement that. And we know that systemic changes are needed, and the fact is that we are all part of the system. So at each level, individual, institutional level, and at each sectoral level as well, there's an opportunity for being part of that change and really shifting our intentions towards a healthier future that can support health and well-being for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laetitia. That was fantastic. And thank you for making the explicit linkages between the extinction crisis, climate change, and human well-being. That's quite powerful. So it's our pleasure now to turn it over to Dr. Caradee Wright. Dr. Wright, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I was on mute there for a minute. I've been tasked with a challenging topic: to consider Africa's economic growth in the context of a low carbon future, while simultaneously considering solutions. The how do we get there that will benefit pressing public health challenges, current and future, in Africa. I gratefully acknowledge input from 3 colleagues in gathering my thoughts to share with you here today. I have 5 slides aligning with the images of Africa shown here. The bottom far right image conveys for me the message of Africa's economic potential as a key global role player. First, let's set the scene. Next slide, please. This cartogram produced by Professor Patz, who's on the call today, is a comparison of undepleted cumulative carbon dioxide emissions by country for 1950 to 2000 versus the regional distribution of 4 climate-sensitive health effects: malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and inland flood-related fatalities. The world maps starkly show that Africa has been impacted upon by climate change health impacts, despite being the lowest carbon dioxide emitting continent. And this is only likely to worsen in the future if several key actions are not taken. The balance between ensuring Africa meets the African Union Agenda's 23, the Africa we want, while avoiding direct and indirect impacts of climate change on health is tenuous, but not unachievable to attain if well thought through steps are taken. However, it would also be a tragedy if we only focus our attention and action on climate change related health impacts. Africa continues to face pressing health outcomes and issues that require action, much of which will likely have climate change health co-benefits, especially in terms of resilience and adaptation. Next slide, please. Roughly 50% of deaths from all types of communicable or infectious diseases worldwide occur in Africa. These include HIV, AIDS, diarrheal disease, and tuberculosis, among others. Several of these diseases, like malaria, have climate-sensitive variables impacting their prevalence. But Africa is also carrying, more so each year, the burden of chronic, non-communicable diseases such as heart disease, lung disease, and cancer. Important factors mediate any attempts to curb and prevent these health impacts. Professor Sir Marmot's social determinants of health, for example, extreme poverty, malnutrition, armed conflict, and government mismanagement, among others. So, how do we move towards a future in Africa that blends growth, low carbon, and health and well-being for all? Let's consider 3 possible scenarios. Next slide, please. Each slide has challenges on the left and possible solutions on the right. First, let's consider to seize low carbon opportunities. Carbon emissions span many sectors: household air pollution, waste burning, vehicle emissions, and more. Wood, charcoal, and coal are still predominant energy sources in Africa, especially in the domestic setting. We need a just energy transition that is multifaceted, a diversified energy mix. Tackling the energy sector, especially low carbon opportunities, is a low-hanging fruit for decarbonization. In some instances, electricity generated from clean energy remains best for household use. We also need governments to strengthen the market for low carbon energy through predictable offtake arrangements, utility purchase arrangements, and feed-in tariffs. Recognizing that the initial capital costs of clean energy investment can be prohibitive, governments and regulators should seek to reduce risks and support the development of the market through appropriately subsidized loans. Moreover, carbon prices need to increase, and we need to ensure technologies are available to bring efficiency to current practices. Next slide, please. Then we need to consider reform in energy utilities, using a model that is focused on equity and human health. Here I will use a South African example. South Africa burns tons of coal annually for electricity provision. Coal-fired power station carbon dioxide emissions contribute towards global warming and human health impacts. We need to transition away from only coal. We need to change an energy monopoly to an energy mix that is decentralized and unbundles power generation, transmission, and distribution towards creating more efficient and stable energy markets. There is a need for decentralizing carbon financing and to consider boosting aid to on and off-grid energy access. We need microgrids and innovative solutions for remote and climate-sensitive areas too. Privatization or corporate energy supply may need a cautious approach to ensure that energy poverty is not exacerbated. Clean energy should be a human right, just as the new UN Rights Council Declaration on the 8th of October said that the access to a healthy environment is a human right. Next slide, please. Thirdly, we need to eradicate corruption. Corruption has a disproportionate impact on the poor and the most vulnerable people, increasing costs and reducing access to services including health, education, and justice. The Corruption Perception Index map on the left glows red for most countries on the African continent. Corruption is often associated with money laundering, illicit financial loan flows, personal agendas, tax evasion, and bribes. In the clean energy space, massive projects may breed corruption with cost overruns, neglecting quality, as well as community engagement, as well as poor management. The World Bank and the African Union offer some solutions to stop corruption. For example, in Kenya, a World Bank judicial project helped establish an advanced data analytics to monitor performance on courts, judges, and courts personnel. Operating as part of an explicit anti-corruption effort, the performance management system is being used in combination with surveys of court users to identify and address corruption risks. We need stringent monitoring and evaluation with continuous review and investment in this type of sustained regulatory reform. Last slide, please. My final slide concludes by reiterating these potential 3 actions that may be considered at COP27 on the African continent in Egypt, and how they may feed into the 3 key foci for Africa's successful climate resilient future. Thank you.
Dr. Wright, thank you so much. That was an astounding presentation. We're going to share these presentations with everybody, but thank you for making the linkages between non-communicable diseases responsible for 70% of deaths worldwide, the leading cause of disability, and the environmental challenges before us, giving a prescription for utilities for reform, critically important choices that actually are in the laps of governments as they change regulations or not change them. And then finally, the issue of corruption, which is responsible for $1.5 trillion of losses every single year, much of that money deposited in high-income countries, just for our information. Really outstanding. Thank you, Dr. Wright, very much. And then the next speaker is Dr. Deoraj Caussy. Dr. Caussy, thank you for being here from Mauritius, and over to you.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. I guess we're sharing.
Yes, but it's not in presentation mode.
Yes. We'll fix that. I think it is now. Yes. Well, hello to all of you. I don't know, good morning or good afternoon or good evening. Pleasure to be with you on this panel to share with all these august speakers, and I thank the organizer for inviting me. I will continue where my colleague, Dr. Caradee Wright, has left off. I'll be focusing on the African continent. This is the work we've been doing with academies, especially the NASAC and IAP and other academies around the world. We're looking at the health impact of climate change on health around the globe, and we're looking for the same solution wherever we're going. Now, we are vulnerable to climate change and health. Africa, we say, is the most vulnerable continent from previous speaker. Why? It's a complex interaction. It's many factors coming together. First of all, on the one hand, we have the high climatic hazard, extreme temperature, causing even melting of ice on the Kilimanjaro. And this melting of ice on Kilimanjaro is affecting the river course, affecting the ecosystem around there, the farming habit of the people who stay there. Then we have sea level rise. We have a lot of coastline around the continent, and we have a small island developing state that are subject to sea level rise with loss in biodiversity and also all its consequences. Then we have adverse weather like flood, drought, and storm constantly. These all play over the physical factors. African continent covers broad range of climatic zone from equatorial to tropical. 60% of the land mass is dry land. 38% of which is desert. Inhabiting this land, we have people with the social determinants, with the socioeconomic features, so-called social determinant. Most exposed people are women, children, and elderly to the impact of climate change, because we have low adaptive capacity due to poverty and poor infrastructure. Now, our health system is also, we have a burden of pre-existing comorbidity. It's non-resilient to cope with the increase in the disease burden due to climate change. And we have a high prevalence of climate-sensitive diseases, as already indicated by my previous colleague. In fact, we will refer to this map that is done by the work of WHO. We shows that the number of deaths that is attributable to climate change. We see Africa as a whole has the highest death that is attributable to climate change. And you can see the density of the colors are not the same. That reflects the vulnerability of the region where we're located, of the people who are inhabiting them, and the other cofactors. But we can have as many as 120,000 deaths due to climate change annually. So the climatic hazard, directly or indirectly, what do they cause? They cause frequent disasters, they lead to crop failures, the surge in air pollution, and climate-sensitive diseases like malaria, non-communicable disease. The net result is we are left with food insecurity, leading to malnutrition. Overall, we have loss of lives and livelihood, loss of productivity because of heat, and social disruption, causing mental health due to, again, climate change of mobility, for instance. So how do we address this? The best way to address is to get it at the core. The core is policy. The policy must address the health consequences in a concerted manner. Having reviewed, for NASAC, having reviewed the evidence, we found health is central to the economic development and sustainable development. We recognize that the vulnerable population must be protected. And to do that, we need to look at the adaptive capacity. We need to have health in the National Adaptation Plan. It's a blueprint for action. It's part of the policy level. Now, despite the Paris Agreement, many African countries have not incorporated health in their national determined contribution or in the health National Adaptation Plan. I reviewed the evidence that exists on our continent. There are a lot of bottlenecks, and it's partly due to lack of technical expertise, financial and human capitals, and interministerial collaboration. So what are some of the solutions? On the right-hand side, I've pointed out this recommendation for COP27 solution. We need to build institutional and human capacity by training of health professionals. We need to facilitate access to the Green Climate Fund. A large proportion of countries in Africa are not able to access the Green Climate Fund, despite that being made available. And sadly enough, health is not even a component in most of the project that is being submitted to the Green Climate Fund. We need to cope with a disaster, with a public health disaster, by building a health system that resilience. In other words, it responds to the needs of the population in normal time and during disasters with the surge. One component we can do is to institute early warning system that will allow us to foresee, anticipate, and cope with it, the extra burden. We need to promote intersectoral collaboration. Health bears the brunt, but often the origin of health consequences is in a sector outside health. And for that, we need to incorporate the WHO health in all policy to mitigate health impact. Oftentimes, when the national adaptation plan is formulated, it's outside the Ministry of Health. Oftentimes, it's a Ministry of Environment working in isolation. And we really need to combat this. There's a lot of co-benefits to that. And one area, for instance, that really comes to mind is the vector-borne disease, where we really need all the ministries to come on board. And of course, there are co-benefits that I have referred to and other colleagues will refer to. Now, we live in an ecosystem. We're connected in the ecosystem by the air we breathe, by the food we eat, by the water we drink, and all these elements are affected by climate change. Therefore, climate change is a global issue. It's not, the solution would not be found within the boundary of a nation, of a country, of a continent, or a region. It has to come with a global solution. And I pointed out to you, we have bottleneck due to various areas, technical expertise, and financial and human capitals. We need to partner. Now, COVID has shown we have harsh recovery to make from our public health system. This gives us also an opportunity to go green when we mitigate. But to do this costs money. So we need to partner. One great initiative is the Green African Transformation, which is a project with Africa and the EU. There are many issues in that project that still need to be addressed. For instance, shall we focus now on mitigation or shall we focus on adaptation? Of course, we should focus on both for health benefit. But the legitimate question for Africa is, we need adaptation now. So we need to empower the local community to adapt to traditional knowledge and practices in many areas. And we need to translate blueprints into action, sustain commitment in finance, and transfer technology, as well as sustaining it. I thank you for your attention, and I want to again express my gratitude to the inter-academic panel and the Network of African Science Academies, for which I represent to the work that I did, and of course, part of a global work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Caussy, and for bringing those pragmatic solutions from the African continent and just showing everybody that the disproportionate costs are being borne by the African continent and low to middle income countries, as Dr. St. Joy sent this morning. But there are opportunities that you've shared with us, and we'll get into that questions and answers. So thank you. Next, Dr. Diarmid Campbell-Lendrum from the World Health Organization in Geneva is with us, and I'm turning it over to him. Diarmid, over to you, and thanks for joining us.
Sorry, just mastering the technology. Hopefully you can now both hear me and hopefully see my slides as well. Kindly just interrupt if you can't. So it's a real pleasure.
Presentation mode. Sorry. Sorry.
Not in presentation mode.
Yes.
Let me try that again.
Do you have more than one screen? Oh, there we go. Perfect.
There we go. Thank you very much. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to speak, and I think my job has been made much easier by the previous presenters who have done a great job in saying much of what I would have said. But I'll quickly run through our approach to this issue at WHO. And in terms of the priorities that we see coming up for COP27, I'll start off with a slightly shorter term view, which is what we're trying to get on the board, if you like, at COP26. Because some of us who have been involved around the edges of these negotiations for longer than we like to admit, I think do somehow live a little bit in Groundhog Day, that each time we try and encourage more consideration of health within the climate change negotiations, and then we find we get to a COP and then we always think, well, we're going to have to go for it again next year. So I think it's right to take the slightly longer term view and look forward to COP27. But I think that there has been some progress on the integration of health into climate change negotiations at COP26, and that's mainly what I'll cover in the next couple of minutes. So briefly, why we think the negotiations are so important. Negotiations aren't everything, international agreements aren't everything, but we genuinely consider that the Paris Agreement is potentially the most important public health agreement of the century. It's usually thought of as a climate agreement, an environment agreement, perhaps a development agreement, but we've been quite clear over the past few years that it is impossible to protect human health on the planet unless we get on top of climate change. And also, I think, as you've heard somewhat touched on by the other speakers, there are potentially huge health benefits from those actions that we need to take to cut carbon emissions. And so we basically boil down the mission of ourselves and we think the wider health community, firstly, to protect people and people's health from the impacts of climate change. And of course, the big challenge that we have is that climate change is not a specific disease with a vaccine, that if we can get it rolled out enough, we can get on top of it. It includes its extreme weather events, it improves conditions for transmission of infectious diseases, but it also has these long-term risks that will eventually, unfortunately, even wipe out some countries that we have. And of course, it's impossible to protect people's health under those conditions. Listening to the previous session, we're hearing about the voices that are not heard often enough. It's been very important to us as WHO to look at what the countries themselves are saying about their issues. So we looked across the vulnerability and adaptation assessments that have been carried out around the world and saw what countries are highlighting. And many of these issues are things that we would have already expected, but there are emerging issues that we had not paid enough attention to in the past. Mental health is one which is really come up very strongly on our agenda and on countries' agendas over the past couple of years. And then the second big mission that we have is to play our part in driving down carbon emissions, because everybody has to play their part in driving down carbon emissions. So the health sector has to step up as well, but to do it in such a way that we can gain these massive health co-benefits. So you probably all know the figures that we estimate that we lose about 7 million lives a year from air pollution, so about 13 lives a minute. And about 2/3 of outdoor air pollution is caused by the burning of fossil fuels. So we really have the potential to really gain massively in terms of health as we cut carbon emissions. And there are potentially even bigger gains in things like sustainable food systems. There's a huge health opportunity there. And then briefly where we see countries are, and the previous presenter has touched on some of this, we see, in fact, that quite a lot of countries are doing quite well, we think. We were surprised when we started to survey a couple of years ago to see how many countries had a health adaptation strategy or plan. And I think there were more than we thought. There's about half of all countries that, in answering our survey, have them. And yet we do have this massive problem that's just been referred to, that there's almost no climate finance going to implement those plans. So we have a real deficit, particularly in the least developed countries. And on the topic of mitigation, we now see quite a lot of countries referring to health in their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, but very few of them assessing the health co-benefits, even though the evidence says these benefits could be massive and could be a really good argument for action on climate change. I would say that's changing just in the last couple of years. It's improving quite quickly, but still not enough. So just briefly, just a quick map to show which countries are doing better or worse in terms of representing health in their nationally determined contributions, the last lot that we reviewed, but many countries are now doing this. And then if we look at the issues that they're referring to, it's similar to the slide that I showed earlier, but I would say that it is a bit driven by those issues that we have better evidence on, not necessarily the biggest issues. So we have particular concerns about things like food security, respiratory diseases and mental health, and particularly non-communicable diseases, and yet they're not very well represented because we haven't had as much research effort put into those. And in terms of the functions that countries are doing quite well on the right-hand side, this is our operational framework for building climate resilient health systems, so building climate resilience into the core functions of health systems. We think countries doing quite well in terms of leadership and governance, carrying out assessments, early warnings, but a series of deficits as well in terms of the functions that we think they should be covering and where they are actually covering them. And this has certainly been touched on by the previous presenter. We have a real issue in terms of connecting up the talk and the awareness that is now coming on climate change and health to the operational mechanisms. And so there is almost no climate finance which goes to health. And then the countries themselves are telling us why that's not happening. The Ministry of Health often doesn't know about the opportunities. Ministry of Health is not connected to the climate change process, lack of capacity and so on. But you've heard these reasons, but we're also getting them documented directly from countries. So just very quickly to bring us up to speed in COP26, where we think there has been movement. So for the first time, there is a strong health programme in COP26. So the UK climate presidency has a full health programme with a series of specific initiatives around building climate resilient health systems, greening the health sector, promoting healthy NDCs, and mobilizing health voices for climate action. And then there's another one on applied research on health adaptation to climate change. That's the first time we've had that. Health is still not a formal agenda item, but at least there's a strong health program there. And now just very quickly on what we're doing in WHO. Earlier this week, we launched a report developed in consultation with the wider health community on the health argument for climate action. So the recommendations that we have are listed there on the right. We're being even quite innovative, I would say, in how we're delivering it. We're having this hand couriered by health workers from Geneva to London and then on to Glasgow to get the engagement of the health community. But we think we have the evidence and the arguments quite strong. We also, this is tied with a letter which is signed by organizations representing 45 million health workers. So about 2/3 of the world health workers, which are basically broadly backing these recommendations and asking for stronger health action. We'll have a global conference on health and climate change in the middle of Glasgow, in the middle weekend of Glasgow. It'll be a hybrid conference. I'd encourage you to register online for that. And that will be both engaging the health sector, but also talking to other sectors about making these connections between health and climate action. And we then have a comprehensive program of technical support to those health initiatives that the UK government is putting forward. And in our case, with a particular focus on building climate resilient health systems. So we're aligning that completely with WHO's technical support work. And just finally, to make that link to COP27, I think the agenda, we think the agenda is relatively well marked out on the links between health and climate change. And again, what I've heard from the previous presenters is very much in alignment with our own views. And I think we now need to try and take the next stage to try and actually get health formally on the agenda at COP27, rather than initially having lip service, now having a strong health program, but still not being on the formal agenda. So I think we have quite a clear plan that we should try and get properly embedded in the climate negotiations next year in Africa, in Egypt, because we think not only is that going to be good for health, but we think that health makes a really positive contribution to the climate change discussions. So I'll stop there and hand back to the moderator. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Diarmid. That was a fantastic presentation of the great work you and your colleagues are doing at the WHO. And I would encourage people to look at the report you cited, but also look at the WHO Convention by CBD report in 2015 on health and biodiversity, a superb report that Laetitia may want to reference in a second. So well done to you and your colleagues at the WHO. So the first question I'd like to ask really starts, Diarmid, where you ended. And I'm going to ask all of you to pipe into it, because it really gets to the heart of it. I mean, how do we move from evidence to action? What are some of the obstacles that you've articulated, the challenges, but how do we overcome some of the obstacles that you're seeing on moving from what we know addresses climate change, what the obvious co-benefits are known, and how do we convince governments to be able to adopt those solutions in a way that speaks to their own incentives. So maybe I will ask, Caradee, you mentioned you had really strong statements, powerful statements alluding to this. Could you want to start off with that? And then we'll go to Laetitia and Deoraj and Diarmid. Caradee, please.
Thank you. As always, it's a challenging question to answer, but I'll give you, I think, what I think is probably a breakthrough example. On Wednesday, for the very first time in at least the 3 decades that I've been working in climate, health, air quality, climate change, the National Department of Health, the National Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, and the World Health Organization met on the high veld of South Africa, which the World Health Organization has identified as one of the most polluted parts of the world. It is the powerhouse of all of the South African power stations. And they have spent 3 days figuring out together in the same room, including some field trips to go and see for themselves things that environmental officials have never seen, things that health officials have never seen, to work out how to put together a technical working group, which stakeholders to involve, and how should they move forward. And for me, that is probably a breakthrough milestone, not only in dealing with air pollution and human health, but for our climate change challenges in South Africa as a country.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caradee. Laetitia, did you want to add to that?
So maybe taking different lenses and really speaking about the involvement of really all sectors, both for the biodiversity and the climate agendas, and especially I think the financial sector. And we know that there's 5 billion a year that are spent on investments that harm biodiversity, for example, and how we can realign those investments really towards nature positive investments, and really also reduce the harmful subsidies, and for example, in particular also in the agricultural sector. So I think really how can we engage like the financial sector to make more positive investments, and also the multilateral development banks also, which channel a lot of development finance, and as also Diarmid mentioned, the lack of climate change health-related funding that is available. So I think that should also be high on the agenda. And at the CBD, we're also working with the private sector, and really we see a change in businesses also who are really much more conscious and aware of the issues. And I think this growing momentum that needs also to translate into action. So this would be my additional contribution.
Thank you very much, Laetitia. Deoraj, you're from Mauritius, and obviously Mauritius sees the impact of climate change very acutely. I want to just flip it a little bit. On the capacity side in low-income countries, is there a space or a need for building capacity across the different relevant ministries, as was alluded to before by Caradee?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you. Climate change is like a mystery. The jargon we use, the language we use is hard to understand for most people. We need to demystify that, because most people dealing with health and climate change are medically trained. And when we start to switch from adaptation, mitigation, we talk of nationally determined contribution, green climate fund, and they cannot grasp it. So we need to demystify, move from the ivory tower to the grassroots level. We need to disseminate at all levels. And in fact, this is some of the work the Academy is doing, our report that's going to come out. is to sensitize all levels, from policymakers to ordinary citizens, so that the science is available to all of them. We have to empower them so they can take the decision. So one short solution, of course, is to have training workshop to build the capacity in the immediate future.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Deoraj. Diarmid, I want to hit on a consequential issue. We've gone from many voluntary targets, whether it's Kyoto, Paris Accords, the ACHI targets on biodiversity, and we're not hitting those targets. So do you have any thoughts on how we move from a system of voluntary targets to a system of obligatory targets that have a built-in a system monitoring, evaluation, and incentives for both action or inaction? How do we square that circle between voluntary targets that have not worked to a system of targets that are obligatory? Sorry if it's a tough question.
No, thank you. And I think it's a critically important one. I think that, I mean, part of the challenge with obligatory targets, I mean, in a very simplistic sense, that was what the world was trying to do when it tried to do the climate change deal in 2009, where there was an aim to say, well, we'll just agree that we're all going to do X, Y, and Z, and it will be obligatory. And the world, unfortunately and wrongly, but they backed away from that. And the Paris Agreement is effectively built on voluntary targets. It's commitments made by countries, but they decide their own commitments within the global goal. And that was the only deal that was possible to be done. So I don't think voluntary targets themselves are the problem. I think it's more the seriousness with as you say, the seriousness with which they are followed up, and that they have public support. And to connect to a bit of the earlier discussion, I think one of the things that we really do need, and which we start to see mobilizing, is just strong public support for stronger action on climate change around the world. You see it in opinion polls around the world. You see it in the reaction of the health community. And it's that basically holds governments to account and stops them either setting a target, which is 2050, you know, we'll do it in 20 years time, and actually says, yeah, but you're not doing enough now. We also need short-term targets, and we need reporting on those targets. I mean, I do think it's one of the triumphs of the Fridays for Future movement is to say, yeah, you keep promising this stuff. You've been promising it for 20, 30 years, but we actually need the short-term actions now. We just won't believe it until we see the carbon emissions start to drop. And I'll just say one more positive thing from the health side. The health community is now one of the communities which is delivering on that in some cases. So NHS England, biggest public health system in the world, has made a commitment to be climate neutral, carbon neutral by the 2040s. They've just completed their first year. They set themselves a target of staying on track for a Paris compliant cut in emissions within the health system, and they've hit it. And so that's a 7% drop within a year within the biggest health system in the world. So that's the kind of thing that I think we need to basically to showcase that people set targets and they hit them. I actually think that might be more important than whether they're legally binding or not.
No, thank you, Diarmid. And you've really also, in your comments, you've laid out a challenge to all of us who are health professionals to get engaged, to be able to ensure that ministries of health know the opportunities before them, the challenges that the opportunities they have to contribute importantly to this existential challenge. Laetitia, I'm going to go to you, and then I'm also going to ask Caradee if you'd answer this for a reason that'll come obvious. Laetitia, Undersecretary Inger Anderson and Executive Director Elizabeth Marema have spoken powerfully about the importance of protecting ecosystems and the co-benefits of that. Is one solution to be able to protect what the International Union for the Conservation of Nature have identified, those 78 critical ecosystems, small footprint on the land, huge impact for biodiversity? Is that a focus we should be looking forward to COP27? And I'll ask you, Caradee, to answer too, because you're living in Cape Town and the Fynbos is one of those critical ecosystems, if I'm not mistaken. And the continent of Africa has huge critical ecosystems. So Laetitia, is this a target? are those red list of 78 ecosystems a target we should be focusing on to protect? And if so, how would we do that? And then I'll turn over to you, Caradee. Laetitia, please.
Thanks very much, Keith, for this question. And actually, at the time when the 80 biodiversity targets were adopted, there was only 13% of the world terrestrial areas that was protected, and very, very limited also on the ocean side. And now this has moved to 15% for terrestrial areas and 7% for oceans. But we really need to dramatically improve those efforts and those targets. And so now we're under the global biodiversity framework and the target 3, we are really we have an ambitious target of 30% of protected areas by 2030. And so to be able to really reach this target, I think we need really more capacity building in countries and more ambitions. And also, I think this health argument also to really understanding the benefits of biodiversity and conserving those highly protected areas is really essential for health. I think that's an argument that is going to be really important in building that. So we really hope that following the GBF that countries are going to also have ambitious targets in their national action plans for biodiversity, and also the countries have to report also to the Convention on Biological Diversity on those plans. And I think transparency is also very important, because we don't have indeed those compulsory mandatory commitments, but I think transparency and really being able to publish those national biodiversity action plans is something that can help reaching those targets and protect those highly important areas, both for biodiversity and for human health and well-being.
Thank you very much, Laetitia. And Caradee, you live in Cape Town. You're right in the midst of a gorgeous critical ecosystem in the Fynbos on Table Mountain and their surrounding regions. Is this an opportunity for COP27 and for Africa to assert this, as African countries to assert this as an entirely impactful goal for the continent and the world?
Yeah, so I have to first correct you, Keith, that while my council's headquarters are in Cape Town, I'm actually located in the inland, quite close to the very polluted power station, Highveld. However, I'm very familiar with Cape Town and Fynbos, which is under terrible threats, not only from land degradation, illegal waste dumping, but also from critical fires, which they're seeing more and more of in recent years. So yes, I think that Africa as a continent has to think very carefully about climate sensitive areas, not only in terms of their potential benefit for health and well-being, what may lay within leaves and insects and animals, but also the enormous value that there is in a One Health approach to living together in harmony, animals, environment, and humans. We've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic how this is a tenuous space in which we operate on Earth. And I certainly hope, it's been mentioned a few times today, but I hope that the One Health approach will be something that is taken forward on the African continent seriously. ILRI's Eureka Center is doing excellent work in this regard. And I'm certainly hopeful that we will see people understanding the value of ensuring that these special spaces are conserved.
Thank you very much, Caradee. And I'm going to turn to Deoraj and then finally to Diarmid before I turn over to our colleague, Dr. Phil Landrigan, who incidentally co-leads the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health. Deoraj, the opportunity for addressing and protecting ecosystems is beyond climate. And you mentioned the social determinants of health, beyond health. You're from Mauritius. Can you speak to the value proposition that governments need to grasp in terms of that protecting ecosystems has a powerful impact on the social determinants of health?
Well, you hit the, thank you, you hit the nail on the head with that, Keith. We are moving toward this way because part of global targets is to show that we are conserving the biodiversity. And I think you all know, not too long ago, we had an incident, Wakashio incident, that wrecked into the coral reef and destroyed some of the reef that is 100 years old. And since then, there's been much more awakening that we have to preserve it, and we're going that way. But, you know, we're right in the center, crisscrossing all the ship going through, and they come within a very short range, and sometimes they miss the pathway where they're supposed to be going. And that leads to, we have had more than one disaster at sea where the ecosystem been destroyed. It will take a long time to recover from that. But because of sustainable tourism, the government is interested in seeing that, and they're doing what they can, lip service or whatever, to get it going.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Deoraj. And I would encourage you to take a look at my colleague, our colleague, Dr. Maureen Lickfield, who's helped to organize this. She helped to run an important conference on the Caribbean climate change in small island states. So please take a look at her work. We'll be posting it at CUGH. Diarmid, you're going to have the last word, and please share with us any parting comments that you can give to the global health community on what we ought to be doing between now and then COP27 that will help to address and square the crux of the issue, is how we are able to address both climate change and the biodiversity crisis before us. Any parting words?
Yeah, that really is the tricky question, or the big agenda. And I am glad that you made that connection with biodiversity, and Laetitia has as well, because all of these things are linked. It really is basically just raising people's awareness of the connections between preserving the global environment and health. So, you know, a One Health approach, or planetary health approach, if you like. I don't think that there is one single thing that everybody should do. I think that the climate change challenge to health is too big for anybody to take direct responsibility for. And I think it is just a case of doing what you're best placed to do within your own sphere of influence. So, you know, we see, you know, it's fantastic what the CUGH is doing in linking out to universities. That's brilliant. It's fantastic what healthcare workers are now doing within their own clinical practice to decrease the carbon emissions of the healthcare sector. It's great to see these activists speaking up for the action on climate change and connecting it to health. And I think maybe the only message I have is basically around collaboration and supporting each other on this. You know, I'm really pleased when I see my colleagues, you know, in working on sustainable food systems, even though it's you know, it's another UN agency, it's another issue, to see them making progress on climate change and sustainable food systems, because we have to support those who also have that same big goal. So it's really, from my point of view, it's just a plea for collaboration and mutual support.
Thank you so much, Diarmid. That is a wonderful comment to end off on. We're all in this together. Earth is our only home. It is our life support system. And as it goes, so too do we. So we really need to collaborate together, and we can. Now, I would just encourage all of our listeners to please follow all of the speakers here today, not only on this panel, but also our other panels that we've had today. Watch the work they're doing, see the products they're producing. Dr. Campbell-Lendrum just sent us all a copy of showed us the report that just came out recently. Dr. Frumkin from Seattle, UW, had just shared the link to the CBD WHO report that I mentioned, and Laetitia and everybody in Diarmid knows so well. Please look at these. These are solutions. These are known. And UNEP, UNDP, the Conventional Biological Diversity, IUCN, WHO, all have great products, toolkits we can use. Take a look at them, get politically involved, get active, and we can make a difference. So with that, I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Phil Landrigan from Boston College, who is a very special guest and is also a co-lead for the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health and did a consequential piece at the end of last year on oceans health. Phil, over to you.